today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, "Men Are No Longer Burning Women at the Stake. They're Now Killing Them by Big Government." There's a couple of important things that I learned when I was doing the research for this article yesterday that I want to share with you that I think are really worth knowing about. The article starts out with the story of a woman in Oklahoma who had a what's called a molar pregnancy. They are never successful, and they very often kill the woman carrying them. And this fetus was dying inside her, and she went to a Catholic hospital first because it was near her. But that is one in 6 hospital beds in America are run, as money-making operations for the Catholic Church. I realize they call it nonprofit, but you know where that money's going. And they refused to help her because they're Catholic. So then she went to the University of Oklahoma Medical Center, but that too was a dead end, no pun intended. They said, "We can't touch you because of Oklahoma law." To save her life, her husband drove her to Kansas, where there was an abortion clinic that was still open, and she had to walk through a jeering crowd carrying signs that said, "Stone all the whores." Seriously, these were the signs at the abortion clinic in Kansas. Now, if it seems to you like women in red states are the subjects of witch hunts, you are right. And when I did a deep dive yesterday afternoon into the history of witch hunts, I was just amazed by what I learned. First off, the Republican Party has turned this into a political thing. I mean, in 1980, prior to 1980, the Republicans and the Democrats were both just fine with Roe v. Wade. Pre-viability abortion is up to the woman. And post-viability abortion is, an issue that the state can intervene in, and appropriately so. I think there's a broad consensus across American society about that. Ronald Reagan had signed the nation's most permissive abortion regulations in 1967 when he was governor of California. And George Herbert Walker Bush, his running mate, was a big supporter of Planned Parenthood, as was his wife, all the way back into the 60s when he was a congressman from Texas. But leading up to that election, they cut a deal with Jerry Falwell and decided to go all anti-abortion, thinking that would help them out. So in doing so, they were really following a long tradition of men seizing political power on the backs, metaphorically, but sometimes literally, of women. The first witch hunts, there were not any consequential witch hunts before the 1500s. Which in and of itself is fascinating. So what caused them to happen in the 1500s? What was it that caused the Catholic Church and then many Protestant churches to start going after and burning women at the stake, hanging them, drowning them, killing them, imprisoning them? Why? Well, a couple of researchers did a deep dive into this, Peter Leeson and Jacob Russ. It was published in the Journal of the Royal Economic Society about 10 years ago. And I'll just share 2 paragraphs of this study with you. Europe's witch hunt trials reflected non-price competition between the Catholic and Protestant churches for religious market share in confessionally contested parts of Christendom. By leveraging popular belief in witchcraft, witch prosecutors advertised their confessional brand's commitment and power to protect citizens from worldly manifestations of Satan's evil. Similar to how, these researchers wrote this, similar to how contemporary Republican and Democratic candidates focus campaign activity in political battlegrounds during elections to attract the loyalty of undecided voters, historical Catholic and Protestant officials focused witch trial activity in confessional battleground areas during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation to attract the loyalty of undecided Christians. In other words, it was political. The witch hunts were designed to get people to sign up to be either Catholic or Protestant, whoever they thought would more accurately or more competently protect them from the evils of the witches. Also, the other thing that I noted, that I learned, was that throughout the late 1500s and into the 1600s, through the 17th century, in Europe and here in the United States, principally in New England, most of the victims of witch hunts were women who performed abortions or provided herbs for abortions, or in some cases were simply midwives. But they were, essentially, and why was this? Why did the witch hunters go after women who did abortions? Well, it turns out that in feudal England, in feudal Europe, actually, children were a cheap source of labor for the feudal lords. The feudal lords literally owned the serfs. They owned, if you were a serf family in Europe in the 1600s, you were the property of the local lord, as were your children. So anybody who was reducing the supply of child labor through abortion was to be, executed. And, there's also multiple studies from that era that show that whenever there was a time of economic insecurity in Europe, there was an explosion of witch hunts. Again, tying, producing children back to economic benefits to the family. So how does this apply to the United States? Well, in 1973, when abortion was legalized by the Supreme Court in the Roe v. Wade decision, the majority of workers in America were solidly middle class. Fully 65% of Americans were in the American middle class. 65% of Americans could buy a house, could buy a car, could take a vacation every year, could set aside money for retirement, and could do all this with the wages of one single breadwinner. That was the case in 1973 when Roe v. Wade was passed. And Roe v. Wade was not controversial. The whole backlash to Roe v. Wade really didn't start popping up until the late 70s, early 80s. Well, what happened in the early 80s? Ronald Reagan declared war on that middle class. He broke up unions. He criminalized unions. He froze the minimum wage. He raised taxes on working class people 18 times. He cut taxes on the morbidly rich 7 times. It was a complete reversal. And what we saw over the following years was a $50 trillion transfer of wealth out of the homes and checking accounts and savings accounts of working class people into the money bins of the top 1%, the morbidly rich. Now, what does that do? It produces economic insecurity. And once again, what we see when you look at the 1500s, the 1600s, the early 1700s in Europe in particular, but also in New England, during times of economic insecurity, witch hunts exploded. So here we are. And not only that, this is, this is all about economic competition. If white men who were fat and happy in 73, but no longer, now, if white men could knock out half of the population, the women, and another 15% of the population, African Americans, if they could knock them out of the workforce, by and large, effectively, or at least a large chunk of them, the green pie, as a consequence of Reaganomics, they would have a larger slice of that shrinking pie. How do we know this? Well, and that there were 5 states that had legalized abortion prior to Roe, prior to 1973. California, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, and Washington State. It was also legal in Washington, D.C. And so these researchers went back and they looked at the statistics of those 5 states versus all the rest of the United States before Roe v. Wade. And what they found was that abortion legalization, we're in the break, Sean, abortion legalization reduced the number of women who became teen mothers by 34%, and the number who became teen brides by 20%. Legalization reduced maternal mortality among black women by 30 to 40%. Now, today, this is leading to suicides, and I'll tell you about that on the other side of the break. Stay tuned.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
There's actually a measurable increase in suicides among young women as a consequence of trap laws. I'll tell you all about that. Stay tuned.